A lot of companies have a little bit of friction between the product team and the engineering team. Today on Product Driven, that's what we're going to talk about. How should you run these two teams? How should they work together? Should a company have a CTO and a CPO? How do they work together? Is the future just having a CPO? Do we even need CTOs anymore? Today we're going to talk with Tommy Forstrom. He has a lot of experience, just like me, going from the software engineering side to the product side, which maybe we'll call the dark side, but that's what we're here to talk about today on Product Driven. Tommy, welcome to the show, man.
Appreciate it. Glad to be on.
So, are you a recovering software engineer or you're a product guy?
Tough question. I've been using the words rehabilitated software engineer. I'm a former engineer who still has a knack for like making everything a pattern and a system in my head. But at this point, I'm pretty far down, the dark side. And I'm a product guy. I'm an executive. I'm a business guy first and foremost. But the engineer will never escape my insides.
Well, let me ask you this. So we talk about the engineering teams and the product teams. Why do you think, because getting right into it, why do you think there's friction between the two of them? Why aren't all the engineers like, yeah, we build products. Of course, we love the product team. They help us build a better product. Like, why do you think there's friction there?
I think, there's a million small reasons, but I think the biggest reason is almost always misaligned incentives. And when I say incentives, it can be a number of different things. It can be like literal incentives, like you will be promoted and compensated more if X, Y, and Z. And those X, Y, and Z usually follow functional lines. You know what I mean? Like for an engineer, it's like things that really measure like isolated engineering excellence. Same thing for like product managers. Like, you're going to be a great product manager so long as you ship 20 features this quarter. And things that like already start implicitly tearing these people apart. But then there's the softer, smaller things like what gets you recognized, what gets you a pat on the back, what gets you not yelled at, which, some environments are funny like that. Basically, like what these little things that guide every person's day-to-day decisions. And then there's kind of the more intrinsic motivators like professional pride. If you're a DevOps engineer, you really want to do really freaking good DevOps work and feel like a solid DevOps engineer. And you go to your DevOps conferences and you kind of see what excellence looks like. And you come back to your regular day job and you're like, I can't do this well because I never get the time or the budget or the whatever. And those little things start planting these seeds of discord. And when I say tension to me is a negative word. It's something that like eats away at the ability to collaborate when like antagonism seeps in. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, and I think, is it because the engineering team, when they're working on things, they don't relate everything back to the user, the customer, the product, right? Like you said, you're focused on DevOps and doing deployments or DevOps pipeline or whatever, but you lose sight of like, why are we really doing this? Like, I don't understand how it relates to the customer. I feel like that's the biggest problem with engineering is if you had a graph and on one side you had the customer and the other side you had the code, the developers are on the code side. Like they are so far away from the customer, it's not even funny.
That's true. There's no panaceas or silver bullets, but customer at the center of everything should be somewhere in that short list of potential, cure-alls. But I want to usually put a lot of my focus on the leaders because the organizations generally reflect a lot of what the leaders put out.
100%.
And the leaders can say one thing and another in slidewares and all hands presentations, but then what they say in one-on-ones or functional team meetings, like the eng all hands, or what they specifically put forth as promotion criteria or kind of career bands, you can go from L4 to L5 if you do this, this, and this very functionally aligned thing. Then you basically get that type of behavior on the ground. And a lot of times when you start really peeling back the layers of when company says well, we have healthy tension, and you come and find it's all out war between the functions that are supposed to be one. Under the layers almost always ends up being different leaders pulling these organizations implicitly or explicitly. And to me, almost always the solution has to start from the top. It has to start from full departmental alignment, strategy alignment, and like you said, customer and customer value at the very center of everything.
Well, I always feel like the challenge is the software developers, software engineers are not enough in the process of product requirements, road mapping, planning, all those kinds of things, right? Most of them, they get their Jira tickets and they do their Jira ticket and they pray they get some kind of requirements that make any sense whatsoever, right? But they are so divorced from the process where I think for me, that's the cultural part of it that has to change. Is like the first step is we need these developers more involved in all of the planning process, even if they're just a fly on the wall in the room. When we're talking about what are we going to build, why are we going to build it, how are we going to build it, what's the deadline, what's our project goals, because at least then the developers get a chance to overhear all those kind of conversations about, well, why are we doing this and who is it for, and it's for our Q3 goal or whatever the thing is, and why not to do this, and we have to do it for this customer because they're really mad, or we're not going to do this because we're going to make that customer mad. Like whatever all those conversations are, the developers usually hear none of it. They hear none of it, right? They just get the Jira ticket at the end. There'll be something stupid like add a drop down to do this thing, but they don't understand why are we doing this.
Yeah, and like usually like the even thornier decisions, the more like not so much like are we doing this or not, it's like do we do the 2-hour version or the 2-month version? You know what I mean? Because like usually a developer
the quick and dirty version or the high risk version, the low risk version. For
every outcome, there's always like a million ways to get there. And again, if you as a developer are not like interested in and exposed to full big picture, like how are you going to make those decisions or how are you going to like drive those perspectives? And I've seen all variants of that problem where like sometimes it's a push problem, sometimes it's a pull problem, sometimes it is literally like you as a developer are excluded from the upstream decision making.
Yeah.
And I've also seen kind of the almost like developer apathy where it's just I don't care, just like freaking give me the tickets. And like these are both equally toxic but very different, where like some engineering communities need to almost be like nurtured to health to like care beyond their kind of functional realm, and then some organizations need to be taught that like, look, you've got insanely creative people in your engineering org who not only benefit from the information but can contribute to better decisions, and like sometimes a mix of both. But you're right, like to me the whole handoffy process of there's this like group of people X who do the upstream like problem definition and solution exploration, and then handoff, because you see a lot of designers suffer from that too. Like designers get like the business problem handed to them. It's like, okay, just like design a flow, Figma monkey, and they're like, where did this come from? Like, what is this connected to? And then of course usually engineering's at like the very tail end of that stream, and sitting there like, okay, you're asking me to put a drop down on this part of the page, like what the hell's going on?
Well, my favorite is the people that complain that they wish the developers would just do exactly what they're told. But we know developers are never actually told exactly what to do. And if you want to treat the developers overly literal, where like you have to do this exact thing and sort of micromanage them, they can never do a good job anyways, because the developers have to ask potentially dozens of questions to figure out, why are we doing this? How should it work? Like it's not possible to tell a developer exactly how to do something and expect them to do it. Like you wouldn't want that anyways. You would want them in their head to take your basic product requirements, and then they have to think through all the technical requirements, right? Like we said earlier, is this quick and dirty? Am I building this thing military grade? Am I worried about performance, scalability, authentication, error handling, logging, QA, like all these different things? And then ask the right questions to figure out like, what about this? What about that? What about this? What about that? Like you don't want them to only follow the exact directions. Like you literally want them to think. If you're saying like, I don't want them to think, I only want them to do exactly what I want them to do, you're already failing. Like you're setting yourself up for failure from my perspective.
Well, I think the other thing that's really missing from that, not only like everything you just said is exactly true, but the other really critical thing that's missing is that it's not a linear journey, right? Like, yes, you should think of the customer and the problem first and then the solution space and whatever. But like eventually if you think of like the actual solutions as like a downstream thing, you're ignoring the fact that like the opportunities and the options we have on like how do we solve this problem might change the way we look at the whole kind of opportunity space, which is like a dumb, complicated way of saying like, let's say we have some customer problem, like nothing's worse than coming up with examples on the fly, but like some pretty hairy customer problem, and you're thinking about it in isolation, but then an engineer might say like, well, we have this like super easy way, just like drop this component here and bada bing, the thing goes away. Or like, we can just deliver like a simple spreadsheet to solve that problem. Suddenly the way you look at what problem you're solving and how completely changes. But we think of that solution to happen so far downstream and kind of the developer creativity as only impacting like implementation details, when it can meaningfully impact what problems we're choosing to solve, how we're choosing to solve them, and like kind of isolating developers solely to the downstream activities completely negates that.
Well, I think put another way, right? I want to go to my development team and say, hey, here's kind of the problem we're trying to solve. How could we solve this? Give me like ideas, right? No different if I hired a plumber to come to my house, right? I wouldn't tell the plumber exactly what to do. I'd be like, I need to do this thing. Give me like a good, better, best, or multiple ways I could solve this thing. And then let's work together to figure out which way we want to do. And for software development, it could be like, hey, I could do the quick and dirty version of this and it would take me a week or two, or I could make it really complicated and add all the bells and whistles and do all the things you want, and it's going to take 6 months. But if you would negotiate that up front, you'd be like, ooh, yeah, I don't want to do I don't want the 6-month version. Give me the like 1 month version. Like that's what we want to do. And it should be some point of negotiation, right? Of like, how are we going to do this? And you're talking to the experts that know how to build the software. Like they know how to do this. You should be having like some negotiation there.
Well, let me latch onto that word negotiation, because negotiation already kind of implies some sort of like essentially like transactional back and forth. Whereas like, even if like, and you kind of started from like, if I have a problem, like how will I fix it? But what if you have multiple problems and you're trying to prioritize between the problems, and like the top 2 value problems take 6 months to deliver, and then the third one is actually like a day to deliver? Why wouldn't you solve that first? But you'll never know unless the people who can authoritatively tell you the ins and outs of like what's possible, what's not possible, what's expensive, what's cheap, they're not part in the exploration. And again, if they are part of the journey of discovery, it's not a negotiation anymore. It's a cross-departmental, cross-functional journey where different perspectives are represented. And that's kind of, I think, a lot of people got tripped up when I wrote a LinkedIn post about like healthy tension doesn't exist, is that I tried to make the case that you don't need different perspectives. Like absolutely you do. That's why we have these deep specialties. And that's where magic happens, is when a group of people with different perspectives on things learn to come together without tension. It's like, to me, that, and I was being snarky because healthy tension seems to be like a euphemism for like all-out antagonism. I've seen a lot of companies like, hey, we need a product leader to come and like manage the healthy tension. And I ask a couple of follow-up questions. It's clear that like the engineering team and the product management team like hate each other. And I'm like, there's no healthy tension here. So anyway, my point was, if you can get to a point, and I believe you can, where different perspectives are being represented and like strengths are being pooled without tension, like that's the goal.
How do we get there though? How do we get that? Is it's the leadership, as you mentioned earlier, it starts from the leadership above, right? Setting, the just kind of direction of like, hey, we all work together and we're all going to get along and we're going to overshare, over-communicate, and work together.
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple things that I really prefer. Nothing's a silver bullet. Again, like every good thing can fail, every bad thing can succeed. But first of all, I really prefer organizations that try to abolish the whole notion that there's 2 teams. There's the engineering team and then there's the product team, which is like product managers and designers. It's just one group of people with different specialties. Like setting everything up from like this 2 teams, 2 camps already like poisons the well in a way, or muddies the water, to help like put people's minds in this bias of like there's the other team that we have to like interface with, versus there's this one team that works together. And so I generally prefer organizations that have already made that flip, that there's just one team. Call it R&D, call it technology, call it EPD or engineering product design, call it whatever you want. I prefer just calling, I think product development is the closest I've come to a compromise where like I like that term, because it implies everybody's working on product, and development is murkier than like engineering, because it's like we develop and maintain this product that we have. That's, to me, is step number 1, is creating a cohesive team. Step number 2 is really leadership team level alignment. And I'm a big believer in the single executive for all things product model, where I don't care what you call it, but basically the entire org that has to do with building and maintaining the product, laddering up to one executive, will set the tone of, doesn't matter. End of day, there's no tension. There's just like somebody somebody is governing the purse of like where do we deploy our resources and how do we operate. Like those are some of the ways. And then when you create process, like product operations, call it whatever you want, when you create process, I really prefer processes that are like cross-functional, even to a point of inefficiency, where like you pointed out, like the discovery process of like what problem, like which customer are we going after, what problem are we solving, what solutions are we bringing to the table, when and how. It's a cross-functional effort from soup to nuts, where like the engineers are pulled upstream, the product managers and designers are pulled downstream, and it's like, and the incentivization is like everybody wins or nobody wins. You know what I mean? So you don't get brownie points for like beautiful design if the implementation is shit and no customer ever used it. Nobody cares.
Well, and I think part of the reason you need the product side and the engineering side rolling up to the same executive is there is always a big balance, within the engineering team of things you need to do, things you have to do, and the things you want to do, right? Like some parts of the engineering team are always going to be infatuated with technical debt and maintenance, and we wish we could rewrite this thing. We don't like this NoSQL database. We want to move from MySQL to Postgres, whatever the thing is. Everybody's got their pet project. And a lot of times engineers love that kind of stuff, and they love just rewriting things that already work, but we want to write them in a new way. And then the next developer that comes in will think whatever you did also sucks, and the circle repeats, right? Some of that stuff is well-intentioned and needs to be done. Some of it goes too far. However, this is where it has to roll up to somebody at the high level that can make those decisions. Say, okay, I'm willing to do that thing, or I'm not willing to do that thing, and can make those trade-offs, right? Between the have to do, need to do, and want to do, and all the other product initiatives that are out there, and thinking about this from a business perspective as the technology and product leader for the company to make those priorities, right? Because if you leave developers alone in the room, more often than not, they pick some of those pet projects. And at a higher level, we've got to make better decisions about what to put our resources to.
That's exactly right. And like the way I usually look at it is like there's just like one credit card you're charging stuff on. Like it's literally the whole R&D organization, like the millions of dollars that early scale-up stage company spends on basically developer, designer, product manager, labor expenses. It's one pool of I don't like calling humans resources, but at the end of the day, an executive's job is resource allocation, whether it's money or people, attention, priority,
time,
process,
energy, effort, attention.
Right. And so it's not like there's this little slice here that's like, it's not product because it's like really technical or whatever. It's like every second and every second the R&D org spends on something is from the same like zero-sum game pool of resources, whether it's technical or customer-facing or maintenance or innovation, like whatever. It's still one pool of money. And this whole kind of like, I've seen it, I've lived it a million times as an engineer, be like, oh my gosh, I really want to like invest in this module here, but I've never given the time. It's almost more destructive to create this like antagonistic environment where it's like engineers have to feel like they're not heard, or like product isn't allowing them to do the thing that they believe matters from an engineering perspective. And to me, like the whole notion of like having a single executive in charge of all this, like it becomes very much like, I hate to use this analogy, but almost like a politician's job. Like politicians generally know nothing of anything, but they have incredibly smart people in committees, in advisories, like whatever. Their job is to like listen to all the experts. The politics of today don't necessarily always reflect this, but at the end of the day, your job is to listen to the experts and make educated decisions based on the inputs. And that's an executive's job. That's why you build great engineering organizations with great engineering leaders and design leaders and product managers and product management leaders, and you listen to all of them. And the hardest part when you come to a CPO job as a CTO, like a seasoned technologist, is almost to like suppress your deeply technical inside voice. Because like, for example, for me, my first years as a leader, I really sucked because I always prioritized the engineering voice because that's the voice that was loudest in my own head. And it took me years to like amplify the design voice or amplify the business voice because those weren't loud enough. But that's kind of the fine tuning you have to go through when you come to that like executive role. It's like you have all these different frequencies and you have to like almost have a little mixer on how loud these voices can become.
Well, so here's what I want to talk about now. I want to talk about the difference between a CTO and the chief product officer. And I think you and I both agree that if I have any kind of CTO, I want them to be product minded. I want them to have the product vision. I want them to really own the product and understand that part of it. But I think it's also important to understand in a lot of bigger companies, the head of product has kind of a different role that's not all engineering related. It's not all product development related. It's also product marketing related. It's also industry research. They're on calls with Gartner. They're talking to Forrester. They're helping the marketing of the company. They're helping, think about somebody at Spotify or whatever. They're probably like, if we change the button from green to blue, will we get more people that subscribe to Joe Rogan's podcast? And like product utilization, and there are a lot of facets to product that a lot of people don't really think about. And I've ran a lot of SaaS companies and inevitably been forced down some of these. And as the CTO and founder, I don't like talking to Gartner and Forrester and doing all this kind of stuff, but it's probably, it's kind of part of the job. When you're the CTO that owns the product vision, you're the founder. But so I'm curious, as we talk about like CTO and CPO, how do you also see that part of the work?
Yeah, so I mean, oftentimes, and I want to be really careful when I choose my words carefully here, because a lot of time when I say there should be no CTOs, there should just be CPOs, what CTOs hear is oh, so we're redundant now. When in fact, my core message is the exact opposite. I want to put you as a CTO on a freaking pedestal and clarify what your true job is. And of course, context matters so much. Small company, big company, true software product versus kind of service software combo or software enabled, there's so many different variants and none of these answers are truly universal. But basically the simple litmus test for a CTO especially is which one do you care more about, being a functional leader, meaning a leader of engineers and technical bits and bobs, or being an executive? If it's the former, then hell, be a VP of engineering, be a director of engineering, be somebody whose literal job is to lead engineers, make engineering decisions. But if it's the latter, if you want to be an executive, then please take on the other stuff. Because it's, I don't mean to be flippant about it. A CTO turning to a CPO, it's not that much. You need to learn the language of business and learn how to be business savvy and understand customers and how, customer value gets converted to business value, gets converted to enterprise value. You need to understand the world of product management design enough to lead experts in that realm. You don't need to be as good at their job or better as they are. You can be a total dilettante as long as you understand how their work ladders up together. And heck, you're done. You don't need to worry about somebody hiring a CPO or CDO, chief design officer, or chief creative officer. You can now be the one executive. And I'd almost say the rate of success for an engineering leader to convert to chief product officer is much higher than somebody randomly rising up from a product management or design org. So I would rather tell the CTOs of the world, it's you're this close to being ready to be the one executive to kind of govern all of R&D. Why not just take the plunge?
Well, and as you said, I think it matters a lot, the size of the company. But one thing I think we can agree on, in a very small company that has an engineering team of less than 10 people, like a small SaaS company, I would actually say having a CPO who has some technical background, who understands technology, they don't need to be hands-on in the code every day, right? And we want them focused more on product, would be beneficial in a lot of ways, because what you don't want is the CTO who's the hero and they're actually the lead developer and they're the ones who got to save the day and fix the code and do all the stuff. You want to build an engineering team that's self-sufficient. But the biggest problem for startups is not usually building the product. It's sales and marketing. It's how do we grow and scale this business? And so if you take that person and say, hey, look, your goal isn't to focus all on the technology, it's to focus on the product. And by the way, part of that is figuring out how do we sell this product? I think there's a big benefit. Does that make sense?
It makes a ton of sense, and I like that we're zooming in on specific scenarios now, because again, like I said, everything I just said is mega generic, and context matters so much. But when you zoom into very specific scenarios, you start getting a little more nuanced answers. Like you mentioned, a startup, specifically an earlier stage startup, let's say probably 50 people in headcount, probably 3 to 5 million in revenue, 10 people in the engineering team. At that stage, I wouldn't even. Again, I'm being overly contrasty here because that's how you get good points. Generally, the product brain of a startup that early on has to be the founder or founders.
Yeah.
And And the founder, of course, can be a CEO and a CTO, or like kind of founding teams can come in many shapes and sizes. And I don't really care what you call things at that early stage. It's like street warfare at that point. It's just take no prisoners, like hustle and grind. You're CTO, but you're also like, mid-level developer at the same time. Like titles are like just they don't really mean anything at that early stage.
No.
I wholeheartedly agree. Like, it's perfectly feasible to basically just have like the person that just keeps the pump going. They can be called CTO. The only place where it gets dangerous is when that company scales up, and then you have somebody with a
They
title.
don't scale with it.
They don't scale with it. But they might be great. They might be like an incredibly valuable person for that company. And very few people are comfortable with you shouldn't be CTO anymore, but you should stick around and be like lead developer or run this, whatever works best for your skills. You're kind of painted into a corner with your back against the wall when there's already somebody there as a CTO, and then you step into an era where titles start mattering, structure starts mattering, because a lot of genies just don't go back in the bottle that easily.
Titles are free, and titles don't matter until they do, right? Like, That's the challenge, is there's a certain amount of expectations that come with these titles. And when you're a really small company and you're like, hey, I just need like a lead developer, and they're going to manage a small team that's maybe offshore or whatever, pick your title. It doesn't matter. You can be CTO. But now all of a sudden you're like, hey, you have 50 employees and you need to manage all the executive stuff and business and strategy and all these things. Like, that's way over their head. And I know because I was that guy. So I get it. I was there.
Yeah, it's a hard conversation too. It's hard for the founders. It's hard for the CEO because they've usually been through hell with this person. They've gone through so many hard things that for them, the conversation of like, look, it seems our context has changed and I don't think you can be in this position anymore is insanely hard. And it's like, there's so many emotions there. And like, so a lot of companies just kind of like roll with the setup, whatever worked for them in the, sub 1 million, sub 5 million days. They just kind of keep trucking along because the human level of those conversations is so freaking gnarly. And then the worst thing that happens is usually you just like blindly hire more senior leaders, and you almost like force the new senior leaders to be the person who's like, oh, I don't think this legacy part of this thing works. It's just, it's really frustrating.
It's especially hard if one of the founders is that person. It's like they have to grow, to stay in that position. Like it's even more important. Well, I think there's been a great conversation about the healthy the healthy friction between the engineering team and the product team. And I think we both can agree that whatever you're doing in an organization, it's got to start from the top down. Like whoever that CTO is, CPO is, the CEO, whoever is in charge of this thing has got to set that kind of tone, character, and direction of like, hey, here's how we want to do things. And as part of what I'm doing with the new product-driven channel that I've launched, this is my whole focus. I want to help people understand this gap between software engineering all the way through product, because most people don't understand there's a huge gap. A lot of software engineers are so divorced away from the product side. And as we go forward, especially if AI is going to become more and more of a thing, and as things continue to change, developers are going to have to start thinking more and more with a product mindset, and that's what we've always needed. But I think it's even more important today, especially as some software development stuff becomes easier and easier to do. I mean, the developers could sit around all day and be like, well, tell me what to do, and then I'll go write this little AI prompt and I'm done for the day, and I wait for the next product idea. Like, we need owners. We need people to own things. I think that's the biggest thing that we really, really need.
It really is. And it's funny, like, as long as I've been in software for like 25 years, there's always been this talk of like the 10x developer. Yeah. And I've always deeply believed that we really suck at identifying those, because the real 10x developer is the one that like 2x's everybody around them. And usually, like, at least anecdotally, everybody I've worked with in my past who's, at least from my perspective, has been a true 10x developer is the one that sparks everybody's interest around them in the customer problem, in the business context. And not only that, but also like again, going back to our core topic here, alleviates the tension by making themselves an asset to the designer, to the product manager. It's always ready to like, be a little less efficient in moving Jira tickets along, in favor of like high quality conversations around what the hell are we doing here? Why are we doing it? How is it driving value?
Yep.
And those, I think, the people you're basically trying to help everybody become are the real 10x difference makers.
And I think I've always been that person in my career. I've been one of those 10x developer kinds of people because I understood what needed to be done and I could also build it.
Yep.
And when you have both of those things together, that's where the magic happens and that's where the productivity really comes from, versus having one person understand what needs to be done and they're constantly trying to translate that to somebody else who just doesn't understand it. They don't understand the big picture. You're chasing them around, getting them to follow directions, follow what it says in the Jira ticket, and then they don't do it quite right, and then they got to redo it again. Versus you have one person that owns and has the product vision, has ownership of whatever the project is, whatever that part of the pie is. Like, you don't have to have ownership of everything in the company, but you can have ownership of a certain feature, module, product, project, whatever it is, where it's like, hey, I understand what we are doing and why we are doing it, and now I can go implement it, and I can implement it way faster because I understand why we are doing this thing.
Right. It's just like one of the things you always kind of end up in these conversations about, like developer productivity and how are you measuring it? And usually the ways that people, whether you're talking about things like Dora metrics or any like crazy old school ways of like gleaning it from like Jira ticket cycle times, or like hell, who's like lighting their keyboard on fire by like putting so much code in, that really, those all fail to really highlight and like surface the people who like get it and who help other people get it.
I'm sitting here laughing in my head about measuring developer productivity, because for what we're trying to do on the product driven development and thinking about the product mindset, I would almost say, do you measure productivity by how many questions the developer asks?
Yeah. I mean, there's some, even though like developer productivity is such a quagmire of misery historically, there's some like smart things that people have done. Like I've seen people who measure the sentiment of like code review comments, and like I don't think there's like a pot of gold at the end of that rainbow, but at least it's like finally the conversation's turning to something a little more soft than the, you know, how many pull requests did you do and like all that fun stuff. What's your defect rate?
Well, Tommy, I really appreciate having you join me for this conversation today, part of our product driven series. Excellent conversation. I'm glad we both started in engineering and have kind of gravitated to the product side. We'll call it the dark side today, but ultimately that's what drives the business, is building a product and thinking about, okay, how do I sell this product? How do I keep my customers happy? How do I have empathy for my customers and build something that they want, you know, and they want more of and brings them joy and they will continue to pay for, not the code. Like, nobody honestly cares about the code. They care about the product, the final outcome of this thing. So thank you so much for being here today.
My pleasure. It was a fun conversation. Thanks for hitting me up.
Thank you, sir.